Hi there, welcome again to another useful episode of The Art of Business English. Andrew Ambrosius here for episode 89, and just wondering, have you ever heard of indirect questions? Maybe you have, or maybe they're a mystery to you. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So let me give you an example. I was wondering what time it is. Okay, I was wondering what time it is. Do you see what I mean? That is an example of an indirect question in action, and you'll notice that it has a structure that is very similar to a direct question, but they're not the same. So in today's episode, first I'm going to give you a quick overview of direct versus indirect questions. Secondly, we'll be looking at how they are formed. Then we'll look at some indirect question phrases, okay, and finally I'll show you or explain to you how they're useful for different business situations, okay? So let's start by looking at direct questions. Let's start by making a comparison, okay, between direct questions. Most of us have no problems with direct questions, okay, because, in fact, it's something that we use every day. And direct questions, as you may be well aware, are formed using auxiliary verbs such as do, does, or did. And direct questions are also formed using interrogative pronouns such as what, when, or how. Okay, so let's look at some examples of direct questions in action. Do you live in Barcelona? Is a direct question. That is a yes/no question, so it's closed. Did you go to the party last night? That's another direct question, and it's closed because the answer is yes or no. The next one is, what time does the party start? So that's an open question because it's using the auxiliary what. And when did Peter visit you last week is also another open question, and that's also a direct question. And how did Peter get to the airport? So another open question because it's got the interrogative how, and it's also a direct question. So as you can see, these questions are very simple and they're everyday question types. So we use them when we're talking to people in English. Obviously, it's quite easy. There are also many more question forms, and we can form them in different tenses. So obviously the future, the past, etc., etc. So direct questions, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. We should know them quite well. But what about indirect questions, and what are they used for? So let's have a look at that. What are indirect questions used for? Well, indirect questions, on the other hand, are a little bit different from direct questions, and that's why they are referred to as indirect questions, because they are less direct. We don't just go and straight up and ask people, okay? So we use indirect questions when we want to sound a bit more formal, okay? A bit more polite. They're used to make polite requests for people. For example, people we don't know, or people in positions of authority, or when we are asking favors of people, that's also important, and when we want to make that request sound nicer. Okay, so that's sort of when we use them, or what they're used for. Remember, when we speak to people in a less direct way, it sounds more polite. Okay, in English we're quite polite, therefore indirect questions are a great way to ask people polite questions. All right, it's important. Now just remember that, okay? In English we speak less directly to sound more polite. So how do we form indirect questions? Well, that's a good question. Let's have a look at some indirect question phrases. So we now understand the difference between indirect questions and direct questions. So we've had the comparison. Let's look at how they're formed. And as I mentioned before, they're often used to make polite requests of people. Therefore, they require an introductory phrase to form the sentence. And that's what we're going to look at now. If you would like to review our previous episode from The Art of Business English on making polite requests, then you can check it out. It's episode 66. Okay, I'll be linking to that on over at the AOB website, so check it out. If you're looking at this post, you can click on the post. And in episode 66, we covered using conditionals and modal verbs to sound more polite and less direct. Okay, so when we want to sound more polite and less direct in English, we can use conditionals to sound less direct, or to form indirect questions, we must also use some of the following indirect question phrases. So let's have a look at those. The first one is, Can or could you tell me? So can or could you tell me? Would you mind is also very common. Would you mind? Te importaría. Do you know? Do you know? And then we can follow up with a question, but indirect way. Would it be possible? So would it be possible? Sería posible. And then the next one is I was wondering. I was wondering. So me estaba preguntando. And another one is do you have any idea? So do you have any idea? And finally, is there any chance you, or is there any chance? Okay, so those are these indirect phrases that we use, question phrases, to form the structure of an indirect question. So firstly, we need to introduce the question with one of these phrases, and then we must use a different word order or structure to finish the request. Now, when I say a different structure, I simply mean that in some cases we don't use auxiliary verbs such as do or does, and that verbs such as is or are, they change their position in a sentence. So we're going to go into detail now. Let me demonstrate. The first example is a direct question. So where is the nearest metro station? Okay, where is the nearest metro station? So where is the nearest metro station? You can see that it's very direct. Maybe in Spanish or another language it would sound okay, but with English this is very direct and to the point. So if you meet someone that you don't know on the metro or in the street and you say, hello, where is the nearest metro station? It's quite direct. So, if we don't know that person, maybe we want to sound more polite. So the indirect and more polite version would be, do you know where the nearest metro station is? You'll see the verb is at the end. You'll notice that with this indirect questions, with is or are, in this case, the order changes and the verb is or are comes after the main subject, which in this case is metro station, okay? So you will also notice that indirect questions with is or are, the order changes and the verb is or are comes after the main subject, which in this case is metro station. So let's look at indirect questions with auxiliary verbs do, does, or did. It's important to note that indirect questions don't contain auxiliary verbs do, does, or did. Let's look at this example. How many employees do you have? So that's the direct version, but the indirect version would be, I was wondering how many employees you have. So I was wondering how many employees you have. So both these questions are open questions because they're using an interrogative pronoun and they cannot be answered with yes or no. You'll also notice in the indirect form that we have completely removed the auxiliary verb do. Now this is the most common mistake that I see with English language learners. They will include the auxiliary and make a direct question even when using an indirect question structure. For example, I was wondering how many employees do you have? Now that's the most typical mistake. Obviously the do needs to be removed because we don't use auxiliaries do, does, or did in these indirect questions. So yeah, we have to delete that. Now let's look at indirect questions with auxiliary verbs have, has, or had. Now this is a bit different. When we're using the perfect tenses, such as the present perfect, the past perfect, the auxiliary verb appears in both the indirect and direct forms. So let's take a look. Now the first example is the direct question with the interrogative pronoun why. So why have you bought another motorbike? So why have you bought another motorbike? Now the indirect version is, could you tell me why you have bought another motorbike? And so could you tell me why you have bought another motorbike? So you can see that the auxiliary verb is being used in both forms. However, the sentence word orders change, okay? So indirect questions have comes before the subject, okay? And in the indirect question, have comes after the subject, okay? So direct before the subject, for example, have you, but with the indirect question, it comes after the subject, so you have. All right, so it's not a question structure in the indirect form. All right, right. Let's have a look at the next one. Indirect questions with can and could. So, as is normal with English, we often make requests using can. It's obvious, no? It's a simple way to make requests. of people. However, we must note that when we transform the direct question with can to an indirect question, then we must change the verb can. Let's take a look at this. So the first one is, can you help me with this report? So that's a very typical request, no? Can you help me with this report? And the indirect form of the verb, we would say, I was wondering if you could help me with this report. Okay, so I was wondering if you could help me with this report. Or, do you think you could help me with this report? Do you think you could help me with this report? So from these two examples, you can see that we change can to could. Now remember that could is less direct and therefore much more formal than can. All right, the next one is we're going to be looking at closed question forms for indirect questions. So remember I said earlier, closed questions are questions that have auxiliaries do, does, or did, and they can only be answered like with yes or no. So let's turn and have a look at these yes, no, or closed question forms in indirect questions. Remember, closed questions are formed using auxiliary verbs such as do or does, and they can only be answered with yes or no. The indirect question form for yes, no questions is similar to reported speech in English. I'm not sure if you know reported speech, but we must use if to help us form indirect questions. So let me show you how that's done. So the first one would be, do you want to come to the Christmas party? So that's a yes, no question. Do you want to come to the Christmas party? That's direct, and you can only answer it with yes or no. The indirect form would be, I was wondering if you want to come to the Christmas party. I was wondering if, so you see here I'm adding if you want to come to the Christmas party. Another example, direct. Will you be attending the trade fair next month? Will you be attending the trade fair next month? And the indirect form would be, could you tell me if you will be attending the trade fair next month? One more example. Has John been to Barcelona before? Has John been to Barcelona before? Indirect. Do you know if John has been to Barcelona before? Okay, so these are examples of where we need to use if, because these questions are yes, no, or closed questions. Let's look now at the direct and indirect question comparatives. I've just made or put together a little table. You can check out this table over at the Art of Business English website. It's up on this episode's post. So, for example, let's have a look at the first one. Where is the nearest metro station? That's direct. Indirect would be, can you tell me where the nearest metro station is? Remember the verb to be at the end. Can you come to the Christmas party? Direct. Indirect, I was wondering if you could come to the Christmas party. Remember, if it's a yes, no question, you need to use if. I was wondering if you could come to the Christmas party. Is John coming to the trade show? So again, this is a yes, no question. Is John coming to the trade show? Yes or no. Do you know if John is coming to the trade show? Another one, where is the toilet? So this is an open question. Where is the toilet? Now, in the indirect form, it would be, could you tell me where the toilet is? Remember, if there is the verb to be in an open question, it goes at the end. Now, another one, direct. Could you help me with this report? Could you help me with this report? The indirect form would be, is there any chance you could help me with this report? Is there any chance you could help me? So the order changes. Okay, the subject, then the verb. So you could, as opposed to in a direct question, could you? And the next one, can you give a company tour next Monday? Can you give a company tour next Monday? So that is direct, and the indirect form would be, I was hoping you could give a company tour on Monday. Okay, finally, did you manage to finish the project on time? Did you manage to finish the project on time? And indirect would be, I was wondering if you could manage to finish. Sorry, I was wondering if you managed to finish the project on time. So that was a yes/no question. So we use if. All right. So let's just wrap things up here. We're going to move on to using indirect questions in business situations. This is the last part of the episode. So now that you understand how to form these questions, let's take a quick look at when they can be applied to business situations. So firstly, they are great when you're receiving someone at your company. For example, if you're receiving a guest or a supplier or a client, and you want to make some polite requests. For example, you could say, I was wondering if you would like something to drink. I was wondering if you would like something to drink. This is much more polite than the direct form, which is, do you want something to drink? Secondly, they're great when you're away on business or you're traveling. It sounds much better to ask someone on the subway an indirect question than a direct question. For example, can you tell me which stop I need to get off at for the Natural History Museum? Can you tell me which stop I need to get off at for the Natural History Museum? Okay, so that's a little less direct than tell me or which is the next stop. Okay. Thirdly, they're great for asking favors of your colleagues or your suppliers. Okay, you need to ask a favor of someone. If you want to get things done, then you should try and be as polite as possible in your requests, and it's much more likely that you'll get what you need. So, for example, you could say, I was wondering if it's not too much trouble, this is also nice, if it's not too much trouble, if you could urgently send me a replacement. Okay, I was wondering if it's not too much trouble, if you could send me a replacement. Okay, so those are some situations where you can use indirect questions in business. Let's wrap things up with our final thoughts. Well, as always, there you have it, my friends. An overview of indirect questions and their use in speaking and making you sound less direct and more polite. Remember, they're easily confused, and the most common mistake that I hear is when people include the verb do or the auxiliary verb do or does or did in an indirect question when they're speaking. That's the most typical mistake that non-native speakers make. So just be aware of that, okay? And before I go, don't forget that we have just put the finishing touches, well, I'll be doing it this week, I'm just putting the finishing touches on the AOBE University courses page. We've got all our courses listed at the AOBE website. We've got a load of courses. I think I've got about 8 now, or 8. I think I've got 8 courses up there now. So there's business and general English. Check them out. All of the courses have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you've got nothing to lose. Check them out. You've got general English from pre-intermediate level up to upper intermediate level. We've got courses for the Cambridge First Certificate in English, which is a internationally recognised certificate. We've also got courses for the Cambridge Advanced Certificate in English, which is also internationally recognised English certification, which is great to put into your curriculum or if you need it to get a visa when travelling. And of course, we've got a few business English courses up there. We've got live one-to-one coaching, and I'll be working pretty soon and putting out the next powerful presentation group coaching program. So stay tuned for that. And be sure to check out the how to engage people in social conversation course, because I'm going to be sending out probably, it's going to need to find the time, but I'll be sending out some final emails just before I wrap up that promotion for AOBE listeners and members. There's a 50% discount going on now. Haven't really been pushing that because I've been a bit busy with the start of the course, but that's life. So check it out before things get, before that disappears. And yeah, stay tuned. We've got lots more things coming up for this year. So I hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you did enjoy the episode, make sure you share it with your friends, family, colleagues, whoever. And if you would be so kind, put me a 5-star rating over at iTunes. That would be great. Okay, people, thanks very much. As always, it's been a pleasure. Take care. Bye for now.